Hi everyone, welcome. This is Showing We Care, improving involvement through demonstrating empathy. This is one of Co-Create's learning lunches. The idea of these short webinars is just to present some of the experience from our work. It's half an hour, so it's not an exhaustive coverage of the subject. It's more about presenting a set of ideas and experiences that hopefully you're able to take off and use in your work. We're on LinkedIn and YouTube Live. The reason we've chosen to be on LinkedIn especially is that it makes it easy to comment, to connect with each other. So for you to connect with Co-Create, but also with other people watching the webinars. So please feel free to use those things to just put in any thoughts that come up for you, things you disagree with, things you agree with, sharing experience, and so on. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Co-Create, just very briefly describe what we do. So we started in 2016 with funding from the Department of Health. We've been working with lots of different people since, continued with a focus in health, but we've been doing more in housing as well. And it's all around co-production, working with people in communities, involvement, whatever kind of terminology you use there. We're a collective of staff and freelance associates with decades of experience between us in involving the public, and many of us bring our own lived experience to our work. Excuse me. So I'm Danny Sherwood, I run Co-Create. I have had chronic fatigue syndrome for over 20 years. I've done quite a lot of expert by experience type work around that, and that is something that informs the work we do in supporting others. So on to today's topic, empathy. So first, I just wanted to describe what I mean really when I'm talking about empathy. So empathy is stepping into someone else's perspective, recognizing that we all have different perspectives we've developed through our lives, and there's a lot of value in being able to step into someone else's. Another way of seeing it is feeling with people. So I've linked to a Brene Brown video there where she describes this further, but it's the idea of kind of feeling with people, walking in their shoes, kind of moving into their feelings in that sense. So it's different from sympathy, which is feeling for people and can have a bit more of a kind of like pour you over there kind of a feeling. It's really kind of getting in there with people. And one of the main reasons I wanted to look at this today is that a lot of us go into involvement because we have this empathy for people. But when we work in big systems, this can end up obscuring our empathy. So feeling empathy is not necessarily the same thing as demonstrating it, showing people that we care. And so that's what I'm going to be looking at more today. So I want to start thinking a bit about the benefits of building empathy into our practice. I'm going to mention 3 here. I'm sure this is not all of them. Please drop in your thoughts and comments on further benefits. So the first thing is that obviously when we develop empathy with people, it helps us to build relationships with them. And that's whether we're talking about working with the public, tenants, patients, service users, or whether we're thinking about working within our organisation or between organisations. So it makes our work more enjoyable. There's something that I've always really enjoyed about being at Co-Create, that we try and make this a part of our practice. And it also makes our work more effective when we're able to understand each other better and collaborate together better. Empathy improves our learning or the data we can collect by supporting openness and honesty. So when we can create environments where people feel comfortable, safe to be open with us, we get more value out of the involvement work that we do. We learn the things that we want to learn. And empathy can support really detailed understanding of causes that makes us more effective in creating change. So an example of this is that, say we are trying to deal with an involvement challenge that's something where access is an issue, which is obviously the case in many areas of health and public services more broadly. Now, access is a category of stuff. It's not a thing in itself. We can't just go out and fix access. We need to know what specifically the problem is. And it's through using empathy, through really understanding people's situations, that we can kind of dig into, okay, what are the specific access issues, and understand the subjective nature of things. So, for example, we often hear, this service, this group is too far away. We can't really just measure things in miles and work out whether that's too far away or not, because what is too far away is different for different people. So by spending time with people, understanding their perspective, we can really understand that, and understanding those causes allows us to create change. So I'll come back to that in a bit more detail later on. What can happen when we miss empathy? So we've been doing a lot of work around damp and mold in social housing at Co-Create over the last year, and this is partly for personal reasons, because I've got ill in mouldy social housing, and it's partly because when I looked into that more, it seemed like a big part of the issue was an empathy gap. So I've spoken to people who work for housing providers who've talked about tenants as if they're kind of, they have everything they need to not live in a damp home, but they do it anyway. And it felt like there was something that's kind of not really understanding the tenant's position there. And so we can end up blaming individuals for what are really the outputs of systems. Similarly, if we think about healthy eating advice, for example, it's really easy to say, well, everyone knows that we should eat plenty of fruit and vegetables. But it's only when people aren't able to do that, it's only by getting to know people, understanding their situation, that we can really kind of understand where the responsibility for that is. Is it about them, or is it the food system, their finance, and so on? Second thing, and this is something that the Housing Ombudsman picked up in their Spotlight on Damp and Mould report. So that's a report investigating complaints around damp and mould in social housing. And this report was called Spotlight on Damp and Mould, It's Not Lifestyle. And that's because they heard so many times housing providers saying that ultimately the root was someone's lifestyle. It's kind of it's the tenant's choice to live in that way. And if that's really the case, it can lead to fatalism. Why would we bother supporting people if they have everything they need and they're choosing not to take action? Then why would you? Whereas when we kind of understand people's positions, that can really create optimism, that feeling that things can change. And finally, opposition can become entrenched when we don't have empathy, kind of opposition, whether we're talking about doctor and a patient, or a commissioner and a provider. We can kind of start to not really see each other as people, start to see each other as kind of representing these organizations or these categories, and that makes it harder for us all to work together. And so often in these cases, we want the same thing. So a doctor and their patient, the doctor might be annoyed with patients, the patient might be annoyed with doctors, but they want to do the same thing. They want the patient to be healthy and move on and not use those services anymore for a while at least. So I'm just going to give a little case study to demonstrate this is somewhere where we've tried to build empathy in our practice, and also where we've learned some things about empathy in practice. So we worked with Rotherham Metropolitan Borough Council on their healthy lifestyle services. So that includes being physically active, eating well, weight management, and smoking cessation, or quitting smoking. And as in many areas, there are issues in these areas. There are people who are overweight, there are people who are unhealthy in different ways, there are people who don't smoke. There are services supporting those things, but they're not being taken up at the rate that would be hoped. So we went out and we did workshops in the community to kind of understand how different people felt about what they needed and how these services worked, and so on. So one thing that we really found was that as we were as we understood people's perspectives and just kind of spoke through in a really open way how they experience these services, what's useful, what's not useful, and so on, it was that we really got into the detail and the specifics about what was valuable. So one thing we learned was, even though different groups might have a focus on, for example, healthy eating or on quitting smoking, it was social interaction, a kind of networking thing that people really valued the most about being in those groups. And understanding how people value those groups obviously allows you to design groups differently going forward and create services that meet people's needs, and also to understand actually those services are meeting another need that maybe they didn't think that they were meeting. Second was that professionals found being in workshops was really valuable. So however wonderful co-creates reports are, we present everything in a really kind of open and accessible way, is not the same as being there in the room, hearing people share their stories. So people from Rotherham Council came to those sessions, and that was really important in being able to kind of build that empathy and deeper understanding. And then finally, we had lots of really nice feedback from workshop participants. One that I really liked was just very simply, "You made me happier." And, you know, we've seen a lot of times that when we spend time with people, we really listen, we create a safe environment, people really just enjoy being in that situation. So we do a lot of things through workshops, and people come out of those workshops feeling like it was a good experience. And that's so important, like, because so often when we're doing involvement work, you know, we're focused on longer term outcomes, often focused on outcomes for services. And so making it feel really meaningful, actually just being part of it, feels really important. So in this section, I want to think a bit more about how we can build empathy into our planning. So again, thinking about the fact that, you know, we might have this personally, but how do we make that show its face in our projects? So I wanted to start with a couple of design principles, or kind of sort of underlying principles that will sort of flow through project design in a way that really allows us to demonstrate empathy at each stage. So the first is to explore behaviors rather than focusing on changing them. So we're often dealing with, in co-production work, we'll be dealing with a challenge or an issue that might well be about changing behavior. But in terms of how we involve people, how we work together, is exploring behaviors that really feels like someone cares. You know, if I come in and I'm straight away on why don't you get vaccinated? Do you know that this is useful? How can we support you to make a different decision? Doesn't really feel like I'm there with you. Whereas we would come in and say, you know, how do you feel about vaccination? How do you feel about the services that offer vaccination, and so on? That is a very different kind of an approach. The second is that we focus our approaches on aiming to understand people rather than communities or categories of people, because these are they're more abstract concepts. It's very hard to feel empathy for a category. You can look at horrible statistics around health inequalities and feel bad, but it's hard to feel your way into an individual. So in terms of the way that you're setting up your involvement, so say for me as a disabled person, if you want to really show me that you care, I need to be asked about me, not as a representative of other disabled people, kind of make a connection, understand my experience. Now, there might well be a lot of lessons that can be kind of expanded out to the larger group, but in terms of how we involve, we need to be focused on empathy for the individuals that we're involving. And then finally, and I feel a bit tentative about quoting the Dalai Lama here because it feels like a Facebook meme doing that, but this is a piece of wisdom that was really important to me personally, and I have practiced. So I have this quote here: all beings want to be happy and not to suffer. And when I discovered this, and I'm sure it might be very obvious to other people, but it really resonated with me and stayed with me, this idea that, while we might have different ideas of happiness and suffering and different ways to get to one and avoid the other, we all want these things. And I think that's a really important starting point for empathy, especially when people aren't doing what we would like them to do. So I just wanted to show a little bit here of how we might use that in practice. And this is based off our work around damp and mold in social housing. So given what I was saying earlier about there being potentially an empathy gap, starting from the point that everyone wants to be happy and no one wants to live in a moldy home. It doesn't look nice, it doesn't smell nice. Most people are aware of the health implications, something we'd rather not do if we could avoid it. So when I've spoken to housing providers and they've said, well, people have the information, maybe they've had leaflets, maybe they've had a talk on keeping your home dry, they have the right tools, we've got extractor fans, we've got heating systems, and they're still suffering from damp and mold, then what's happening there? So we created a model, it's a rough model here, I'm sure there are things to add, but just to kind of demonstrate the point, if I have the information and the tools to take action, what needs to happen between there and me actually taking action? And when you kind of break it down and think of the steps, there's actually a whole process. I need to understand that information. So I need to be able to read, I need to be able to read English, I need to be able to process it. I need to be able to retain that information potentially over a long time. I need to trust it. And this comes up so often because, of course, if I don't trust information, it makes no sense for me to act on it. But lots of people, sadly, have been given really good reason not to trust. It might be their housing provider, it might be services more generally. They might just have generally found in their lives that they are not supported by different kinds of services and therefore don't trust the information that they receive. You need to feel able to act. You need to have that kind of sense that you can change your situation, and you need to have resources to act. It's not that helpful being told not to dry clothes on a radiator if you don't have access to alternatives. So when we spend time with people, we understand what's going on for them. We can really kind of hone in on which part of this chain, or maybe it's nothing to do with this at all, but we can really get to what's going on by understanding people, and that allows us to then work out where to focus our change. Also wanted to think a bit about some different ways to keep the human in the system, and what I mean there is when we're working in these impersonal systems that can kind of obscure the empathy that we put into the process, there are some things we can do to kind of keep things human and stop it feeling like we're kind of powerless individuals interacting with big impersonal systems. So I'm going to mention a few here from our experience. Please drop in any comments, thoughts on other things that would be helpful. So one is being transparent about processes and decisions. This can be difficult to know even when you're within a big organization, but when you're from the outside, things can just feel really opaque. So if you can make yourself a guide to the bits of that system that people you work with need to know about, that can really kind of humanize that bit of the process. It feels important always to acknowledge power imbalances. So when we're connected to services, when we're facilitating groups, that gives us a power that not everyone there has. That's not something we can necessarily change, but it is really helpful to acknowledge that that is present and can affect how people feel and act in the situation. Keep people informed about the next step. So we often mention this, and I was at a Listening to People in Communities conference this week, and it came up several times from people's kind of learning from co-production work. It's a shame that we keep learning it, but apparently we're not sort of doing it enough. But from an empathy perspective, if I've just told you a set of things that are maybe things that have been difficult in my life, or ideas to change things that are difficult in my life, if I'm going to feel like you're really there with me, like you've really heard it, then I kind of want you to come back to me and tell me, what have you heard and what are you going to do next? It doesn't need to be straight away, but it needs to be sort of within a time scale that feels like that was meaningful to you too. Advocating for system change, again, it's kind of an extension of the last point, but if I've told you something that's really not working in terms of my health and the support that I get, and I want to feel like you really hear me, you're really there with me. There's something about you being able to say that you're advocating for some change there, and it doesn't need to be something huge, but it's saying, that sounds awful. I'm going to see if I can find someone that I can share this with so they can do something about it. And then finally, really important, making room for priorities beyond the system's objectives. So we hear lots of times that people, the systems have a particular focus, there's a challenge they need to focus on in that space. That's when we reach out to patients and the public and ask them to kind of help us with that challenge. And if we're not routinely giving people space to tell us what is important to them, it is quite likely to come out at the points when we do make those connections. So in terms of how we're planning to involve people, we want to make space in that involvement for people to tell us more than just answering our questions directly. So how might we do that? I wanted to think first about the way that we can ask questions that build connections. So really fundamental to how we're kind of approaching, whether we're creating a survey, we're asking people to fill in, maybe we're just going to kind of drop these questions in at times when we have people already, maybe we're running workshops, but the questions we ask really determine not only the outcomes from our involvement, but also people's experience of it. Do they feel like we care, like we're there with them? So drawing from some work we did on missed appointments, so the kind of involvement challenge we were asked to support with was people missing appointments. Obviously, this is a challenge across many different types of services, and we were focused on groups of people who had particularly high rates of missing appointments. So in one sense, the question we wanted to answer was, why did he miss your appointment? But of course, from an empathy perspective, that's not a very helpful question. So if I ask you, why did you miss your appointment? One, I'm focusing straight on a negative. It's very narrow. It also puts everything firmly on you. Why did you miss your appointment? So that was clearly not where we were going to start. So what we thought about instead were questions that invite people to tell us more about their lives, and they create that feeling of empathy while we're answering the question. So when we're thinking about, I guess, the access aspect of this issue, so one reason people miss appointments is something around access. It's too far, they're not very mobile, they can't afford to get there, so on. So we looked at asking, tell me about your day leading up to the appointment time. Tell me about your day is something we say to people we care about. It's kind of, tell me about what's happening for you. And it also tells us, we support people to tell us in a really meaningful way what's going on in their lives, and this can tell us more about why someone might miss an appointment, and we're likely to find patterns if we're able to go out and speak to different people. Second, and this is thinking a bit more about the trust piece that I mentioned earlier, what's your experience of our service? Of course, if I've had really bad experience of your service over time, I'm unlikely to value the appointment really highly. That might be a reason that I don't turn up. But again, it's not why did you miss it? It's kind of tell me more about how you feel. And then what are your priorities for keeping healthy and happy? So can we place this in a kind of a bigger picture of what is important in terms of someone's health? And from our perspective in our service, we might see this appointment as really important. but what about from their perspective? What is important? Where does this kind of sit in their list of priorities? So those are some thoughts on how we can ask questions in a way that really supports empathy. And then when we move into facilitating involvement, so imagining, for example, running workshops, and this deserves a lot more space than we have time for today. And I think we'll do a learning lunch just focused on facilitation. Do let us know if that's something you'd be interested in. But for now, just some things to mention that relate to empathy. So the first is making sure that we create a safe space. So obviously a physically safe space, also a psychologically safe space where people can tell us about what is going on for them in a way that just feels comfortable. You know, people will tell you more useful stuff in that environment, but it will also be a lot more, just a much better experience for them and for you. Second, listen, don't fix. This is a really difficult one. So I've had quite a few experiences where I've told people I have chronic fatigue syndrome, and I guess probably what I want to just hear is like, oh, thanks for telling me, or oh, that sounds awful, or oh, sorry, I don't really know what to say. You know, something that's just very kind of personal response. What I often hear is, oh, have you tried herbal tea? Have you tried yoga? Have you tried aromatherapy? And it's and so I know that people mean well, but it doesn't really make me feel like someone's listening and then they're with me. And I've seen this happen a lot where we're supporting people who maybe don't, you know, co-create. We all have backgrounds in facilitation, and so this is a bit more, is kind of simpler from that perspective. But it can be quite hard to listen to people, especially if they're sharing really difficult things, and not try and fix it. So just really kind of check yourself and those you're working with, and just make sure that in that space we're just being really open. There's other environments, and it might be that you're a clinician, and in other spaces your role is to fix. But when we're doing involvement, we're just there to listen. I've spoken about making space for priorities outside of the services priorities. And finally, just think about what you would feel is a caring environment. So again, whether it's about responding to a survey, or being in a workshop, or setting up some kind of event, you know, are the questions you're asking questions that if someone else asked you, would you feel like they were really listening to you, like they really kind of wanted to know what was going on? Would you feel kind of safe in that space? So just always kind of trying to think ourselves into the position that we're putting others in. So I'm going to finish for there on empathy, and just to say thank you very much to everyone for being here. If you'd like to have a chat about doing any further work with Co-Create, we offer the things up on this screen that are all related to co-production, involvement, those kind of things. I'll send out the slides after the session to people who are registered on LinkedIn. If you've not registered, if you'd like to see the slides, drop us an email on the email address up on the screen, and we'll send them to you there. So I will plan a new learning lunch that will be up on our website in a few weeks, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.